Good morning. Last September, along with Byron and Reverend Laura, I attended a 2-evening anti-racism webinar, which was put on by the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis from Middle Collegiate Church in Manhattan. Reverend Lewis has helped to guide Middle Collegiate Church into becoming a church that is more truly multiracial and multi-ethnic than most. The series that we attended was titled The Call Within: Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. I was inspired to find other seminars by Dr. Lewis, and I drew on a lot of her ideas for my reflections today. Dr. Lewis names racism as one of the significant storylines that shapes our lives. Other storylines are religion, gender, family. The threads of these storylines intertwine with each other and shape us. They create the world we live in and influence how we live in the world. The racism that shapes our lives here in the United States is now and has always been dangerous to the very lives of Black people and other people of color. The disparities it creates and the burdens it places on people of color deprive us all of gifts we could share if our common story allowed Black lives to matter, if our story allowed people of color to thrive. The events of the past year make it abundantly clear that the story of race in America needs to change. Thankfully, this story is a write our own ending kind of story. Our actions change how the story turns out. Let me acknowledge that many of you are farther along the journey of dismantling racism than I am, and I don't have any special knowledge or authority to speak on this topic, but it occupies my thoughts and it causes me a great deal of sadness and even anger. My hope is that my own continuing self-reflection and the ripples from sharing it will help us to collectively write a happier, more healthy story for everyone. And perhaps by saying some of this publicly, I will be more accountable to change. If we are to be part of changing the story, we need to deeply understand the story. That deep understanding involves learning the truth of history, of what it is like to be a person of color in the United States today, and of the ways in which racism is perpetuated. Along with many of you, I have started this work. I have read books and viewed films and attended seminars and followed up with discussions. As a white person, I am seeking specifically to listen to more voices of people of color. That's why I signed up for the webinar series. Plenty of what I am learning from my exploration these days is something I have learned before, but with each repetition, I can go deeper into my understanding of this story of race. For example, representation matters. Dr. Lewis reflected on the fact that most images of God and Jesus that are out there are of a white-skinned God and a white-skinned Jesus. That's changing a little bit, although even when she was leading a predominantly Black church, she found resistance to a picture of a dreadlocked Jesus. But when the baby Jesus in the manger at Christmas time is white, doesn't that embed in us all from a young age without anybody saying anything, an idea that whiteness is more connected to goodness and godliness than other skin tones? This is not limited to Christian or religious images. People of power and prestige in the United States remain predominantly white. Teachers, doctors, presidents, and vice presidents. When I was little, I asked if the priest at my church was Jesus. So I smiled when Dr. Lewis recounted that as the Black woman minister leading her church, children sometimes ask if she is God. Imagine how changing the images might change the story. To understand how we individually relate to the story of race in America, Dr. Lewis asks people to consider their earliest recollection of race. My earliest recollection of race is that when I was in grade school, my church sponsored a Laotian refugee family who immigrated to my hometown. One of the children was in my grade, and I was friends with her. I don't recall being aware of any discrimination against them, but they surely experienced it in 1970s Appleton, Wisconsin. A second memory I have is of a program called A Better Chance. My understanding of it was that Black high school students, from Milwaukee in my memory, came to live with families and go to school in my hometown for a better chance. In both cases, the people in need were people of color, and the community that helped them was white. Did I internalize that we should be generous to people in need? I recognize that generosity is a strong touch point for me now. Did I internalize an idea about racial hierarchy in which white people are the ones capable of helping people of color who are apparently the ones in need? I can think of times when my reaction to something was in line with that sort of racial hierarchy. Even the good and necessary and generous things that we witness can leave impressions that place subtle and often unintended divisions based on race. I earned my engineering degree at the U here in the Twin Cities. I suspect there was more racial diversity on campus than in my hometown, but as an engineering student, as a woman starting work in a male-dominated field, the diversity that I paid any attention to was gender diversity. I was 26 and living in San Diego in 1991, when in Los Angeles, Rodney King was beaten by police. I became aware of the brutality that can be fueled by racism. I may have been horrified by the images, but somehow I managed to maintain my impression that race issues were mostly history. Or maybe I just didn't see that they were in any way interconnected with my life. I am embarrassed that it's only been in the last few years that I have started to understand the structural causes and the depth of racial disparities in the United States. Now, I see that we are far from racial justice and that it is long, long overdue. With a greater understanding of racism and how we are in relation to it, it's time to create a new story. Dr. Lewis insists that the new story around race must be lofty. It should critique the old story. It should represent our highest ideals. She says that the new story will require moral imagination, moral courage, and the willingness to surrender that which we hold precious. What are those highest ideals? White supremacy was encoded into the founding documents of our nation. And many of us yearn to build a more perfect union. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about building beloved community. Rodney King, responding to the riots that broke out after the police officers who beat him were acquitted, asked, "Can't we all just get along?" Unitarian Universalist principles speak of the inherent worth and dignity of every person and of justice, compassion, and equity in our relationships. At MSUS, we have named mindful interdependence, authentic curiosity, and courageous love as our common values. There is no shortage of high ideals that have widespread support. In the new story, representation matters. So how do I respond when I hear that a statue has been toppled or a lake has been renamed to something I can't yet pronounce? Can I become more willing to welcome new symbols that better embody those highest ideals? In the new story, lofty ideas will translate our common ideals into actual policies. And though they might sound new to me, there are many lofty ideas already out there. And they've been put forth by people who know what they need in order to thrive because they have been living under the oppression of racist policies. There are ideas to end cash bail, to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves and indigenous people. Some people are suggesting that we defund the police or abolish prisons. I find myself wanting to ask if we can't just do something that is not quite so extreme. And won't all of these changes change things? These lofty ideas push me out of my comfort zone. But as a white person in the United States, I cannot shy away from discomfort as we create this new story. I must be willing to consider not just obvious or easy changes to our shared story, but to listen with that authentic curiosity to ideas that sound impractical or even shocking. I must be willing to imagine how these ideas that make me uncomfortable might transform our country into that more perfect union. Jackie Lewis was asked, what is the North Star for people who want to be allies or even accomplices in this anti-racist dismantling of white supremacy work? She answered, love. But not just a feel-good idea of love. She said, love is hard. Love takes risks. Love is revolutionary. Love is fierce. Love demands the truth. Love stands in and sticks in when the going gets tough. Love cries tears, but then gets moving. Love makes a way when there is no way. She asks us to love her and her people hard enough to help make this an anti-racist nation. How will we answer this call to love? So with that, we can move into our question or response time. And the questions I would pose have to do with, what is your earliest recollection of race, of knowing that there are racial categories? Or is there an event that stands out as particularly important in shaping or maybe changing your racial understanding? And here's where Chris can lead you. So if anyone, it's a big question. It's a big question for a Sunday morning. If anyone has an answer, if not, you can let it churn in your head.
Tom Truenfels.
One thing I remember from growing up is that our family, we had some family friends, and they lived in Switzerland, and that was kind of odd to me, that how we could have friends so far away. But what it turns out is that it was an interracial couple that had married in New York in the 1950s, when my parents were both living there, and had actually left the country and went to Switzerland because of the oppression that they were under in the U.S., being an interracial couple at that time. And so we actually went and visited them one time, and it never really occurred to me why they had to leave until much later when I was told the whole story. So, but at the time, it was just, they were just our friends, and we played with their kids and everything else, and it was just like normal. So that was an interesting backstory, I guess I learned later.
Thanks, Tom.
Janice?
Hello? Hello. Mark, go ahead.
This is Brian.
Okay.
I find it kind of interesting how we talk about racial problems and stuff like that, and there isn't very many minorities in the church, other than sexual orientations and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Janice, you want to go now?
Okay. Three things real short. I grew up with a dad who was very racist, and I became aware of that in high school after reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And my first experience of being a white minority was a year after Jerry and I got married in 1970. In 1971, we had a job in Illinois, and we went into downtown Chicago on a Saturday. And as we were going to the stores, it occurred to me that we were the only people that were white on the street. And that was a very eye-opening experience for both of us.
Deb.
I was aware of racial differences quite early in my life. My mother's mentor was the career development officer for the Gary Public Schools. And my brother and I were the white kids in a youth group in Gary. And all of the other children in that youth group were Black. I remember we made Christmas ornaments that people would put on their doors, and we sold them door to door so that our whole youth group could go see the Harlem Globetrotters at an event in Gary. But one of the programs that my mother worked on was helping the teachers' aides in Gary, in the Gary School District, get their bachelor's degrees. So even at that point, I was little, but I knew that there was not equity, this was important work that my mother and her mentor, Benny Mae Collins, were doing. So, and we had opportunities, like we would get books written by Black authors about race as kids from Benny Mae for our birthdays and things like that. So that's kind of growing up in Northern Indiana. I had those opportunities from a very early age.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes, a small story. I think probably this is my first experience with racial experience that I can recall. When I was younger, 9, 10 years old, our family was able to a cottage on a nearby lake from my hometown, and we had a great time playing on the lake, fishing, swimming, whatever. Lots of other things that you do. It was right next to a camp. It was a religious Bible camp that my mother worked in the cooking in the kitchen. But that camp had many people from all over the United States and some other countries too, coming there for the summer, for the sessions. And there was a young man from Africa, and I forget what country he was from. He was probably, my guess, I was 10 years old. I would think maybe he was like maybe 20, in his 20s. We lived right next door, and I don't know how this happened. Maybe he was just walking around looking at the neighborhood, whatever, and there were 4 of us boys, doing lake things, and he walked up and just started talking to us, and it was just a really friendly, nice fellow. Of course, he had an accent, which was interesting to us too. You know, it was all really kind of intriguing. So as I recall, it developed where he would come and visit us quite often, and we had a little rowboat that we would go out, and he liked to go out on the lake. And I recall that as being a very pleasant experience, and we were not at all aware of any kind of discrimination about him. It was a very friendly relationship. One incident that occurred that sticks in my mind, I believe he was out in the boat with my brothers, and they were out, and it was a very windy, choppy day, and they went out kind of far, and you know, we were watching from the cottage, and a little concerned that they might capsize or whatever, and my grandmother was one of the people watching, and she got very, very upset. And she, some racial epithets came from her mouth. And this is my grandmother was very close. I was very close to. And I didn't say anything, but I thought, how can you say that about him? Because she was directing him. She was putting the fault on that man who was in the boat, and I'm sure that he was doing his best to come back out of the danger. But it was sort of gave me, you know, there, in Wisconsin, there are not many, at least at that time, there were not that many in my small town that were of a different race than I was. And so by her saying that, it gave me an inkling of what kind of is behind people's thinking.
Thanks, Sam. And thanks everyone for sharing. And I see there's been a lot of things, or some things at least being written in the chat too, which we won't be able to read right now. Maybe there's an opening for us to tell these kinds of stories sometime. But for now, we will move on to the next part of our service.
We'll be singing hymn number 1014, Answering the Call of Love. And I agree with Katie. I think we should really consider creating a couple programs in the month to come or months to come where we can share some stories and maybe look at different stories that we share in a sequential set of programs. So thank you so much for all of your stories, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. Bruce and Marie. I can't get the images of DC out of my mind today. Due to some app or Windows systems, I have news stories flash on my screen every time I open it. I know better than to let my eyes wander to the headlines when I'm not intentionally looking for news, but I almost always do. You know the images that are flooding our screens and our radios and podcasts these days. Images of so many National Guardsmen in DC, pictures of individuals who have been arrested following the insurrection, and repeated pictures of the Capitol filled with smoke, violence, and horror. The images we don't see, but that are forever present, are those of the loved ones who have died or are forever compromised because of COVID. You don't need me to tell you how this period of history feels particularly hard and heavy. I've also been listening to people of color over this past week. In my weekly Circle of Peace, my African-American friends are crystal clear that what happened at the Capitol and the disproportionate death of people in color from the pandemic isn't surprising. I've listened to many podcasts hosted by people of color, and they also expressed no surprise. They knew and know the extent of racism and the power of white supremacy in our country. One of my friends who I love so much, who's in his 70s and has lived in St. Paul all his life, said that he feels like he's never been a full citizen of the United States. Can you imagine? Those of us who are not seen as people of color or live that experience may really have to stretch to imagine that. Sometimes I worry that we talk too much in worship and adult religious education about things that are too serious. That after 5 years of serving as your minister, we continue to have at least one and sometimes more services a month that grapple with our shared history, white supremacy, and the degradation of our planet and its precious resources, and more. I hope that the seriousness of where we go in worship is accompanied with the loving embrace of joys and sorrows, the levity of song, and the joyful power of being together on screen at a time when we can't gather in person. I can testify to the fact that all 4 congregations I've been part of in the Twin Cities area are on the same journey of understanding narratives and the real life implication of narratives that have marginalized people of color in our country. All of them are grappling with how to be more relevant in the area where their church home resides, and they're all providing ongoing opportunities for those who are white to deepen their understanding of the true history of our country and how contemporary systems continue to create barriers for full participation and justice for all Americans. I know that although this work of learning and soul searching and understanding our stories, examining our congregations and the larger UU faith, and continuing to look for and enact ways that we can engage in justice work is really a challenge, and it's never ending. It is never ending. We're not going to a finishing point. I, like Katie and so many of you, I wouldn't want to go back to when I lacked the knowledge I have now, to maybe prior to those stories that some of you told, or when my own naiveness and acceptance of misinformation was just left me oblivious to the lives of so many people in our country, people I love, people I know, and those I will never know. The question of what to do and how to make a difference is a perpetual one. The longing for greater diversity in our pews is ongoing for predominantly white congregations. And yet I know, kind of in response to Brian's message, is it doesn't matter who's in the pews. Our work, if you talk to people of color, is for us to continue, those of us who are white, to continue to talk to other people who are white, to continue to stand up, to speak the truth, to center race and white supremacy and bring it to the forefront. We may never have a congregation that looks like diverse in terms of race, but we can be a force in our community and fierce advocates and for change in the world. I would love it if we were known in the northern suburbs as a place that cared about racism and was combating white supremacy, even if we never have diversity in terms of race in our pews. We're called to not remain silent in the face of racist ideas and speech and policies and practices. And I can tell you, my friends, that's not easy. I've been in so many conversations with you, with people you love who have just drastically opposing points of view. As I said, I'd love it if this could be one of our core missions and that we could help change the story. We could change the story in Minnesota and in the northern suburbs. Dr. Martin Luther King understood about intersectionality, and he knew that you can't separate issues of poverty and war and racism and hunger, homelessness and joblessness from any other issue. And that when one of us does better, all of us does better. Our faith, which is built on this interconnected web, which connects us all, serves as a constant reminder that individualism will never be the path towards a country where we are all free and where justice reigns. So I encourage you to interact with this 30 Days of Love. There's some really awesome resources on that website. I encourage you to take tomorrow and actually spend it paying attention to the story of Dr. Martin Luther King and finding celebrations or things you can do that will make you pause and celebrate his legacy and deepen your understanding of what needs to happen in our country. We as a congregation are going to move forward and look at our 8th principle, which is a new principle pointing us towards multiculturalism and Unitarian Universalism in the months to come. So there's much to do. And I have much hope that together we can continue to deepen our spirits and our knowledge and our love for not only each other, but for the world that is so rich and so full of so many and yet still hurting. So I hope this inauguration week you can live into your grief and your fear and your anger and everything else, and at the same time find a way to cherish that which is going to be put in front of us. Our national story is changing this week, and don't forget it. The cabinet will look different. The agencies that run our country are going to look different. There's hope, and hope doesn't mean we get to sit back, but it's certainly, I hope you will take time to rejoice in where we are turning at this time.